Hey, we're back here again, and I'm glad to be here. Uh, Angular across the stack with analog. Glad to be doing this. I mentioned this last year, get a chance to talk about it more this year, which is great. I'm Brandon Roberts. You can follow me on Twitter at Brandon T. Roberts. You can also follow me on YouTube at Brandon Roberts Dev. Angular content there, you know what it is. I'm a maintainer on the NGRX project. We talked about that earlier. I'm also a GDE and an NX champion, so doing some community work there, which is pretty cool. I'm the engineering lead at Open Source, and Open Source is about highlighting your open source contributions and providing insights into open source projects. So whether you're looking at Angular projects that you follow or you want to track your own contributions, you can definitely check out the link here below and see what's hot in Angular and also highlight your own open source contributions. So definitely check that out too. So for the agenda for this talk, I'm going to talk about Vite because Vite is hot right now and it's all the rage. We'll talk about meta frameworks and we'll get into the meat of it, analog. So for Vite, I'm going to talk about some of the features of Vite, just high-level features. You may or may not have much access to Vite prior, but Vite is also taking over the Angular ecosystem, which is a good thing. So, and we'll also talk about the impact of what kind of Vite has done in the broader web. So some of the features that Vite has, instant server start, HMR, which a lot of you are familiar with, hot module replacement. The aim is to have a nice developer experience out of the box. So along with that, you get fast builds and extensibility with plugins, and then also has TypeScript support, and it's just generally fast. So I know we're in Angular, we've been using Webpack for a long time, and Webpack has been good for the community, and Vite is another tool along that way that gives us some nice improvements there. So naturally, I want to be the one to get all these nice improvements too, and like I said, Angular has embraced Vite also in this way and using it in the CLI, but we can expand this into the Angular ecosystem even more. So to talk about impact, this is a kind of broader impact on the web ecosystem. Like I said, Vite has been it's been a mass shift in the adoption in Vite across the web. Projects like Astro, projects like React, Solid.js, Nuxt, Svelte, Quick, Playwright, Vitest. All these things are built on top of Vite and use it pretty heavily for their infrastructure there. And there's more projects here. There's just a few of them listed there. So next, I want to talk about meta frameworks because, like I said, meta frameworks have become very popular also in the web ecosystem, and they just help you do certain things to build apps to move along that way. So we'll talk about those next. So for meta frameworks, I want to talk about like what a meta framework is, and we'll get into some of the features of a meta framework and some of the common features there. So a meta framework is defined as a system one level above that stitches multiple frameworks together. And this quote was by Ben Holmes, who wrote a nice blog post on this, the topic of meta frameworks and the ones that exist in the space today. So we come back to Angular. Angular is a framework in itself already. It already has a core with a lot of features in it. We have, of course, components, directives, pipes, signals, services, and more things like that. There's also routing built with the Angular router, which is a very powerful tool in the Angular ecosystem. HTTP client, which is built on top of observables and recently got things like fetch support, is also there. Forms, we have reactive forms, template-driven forms, and we'll see what happens in the future with those. And also SSR, server-side rendering. This is kind of managed as a separate thing today, but SSR is definitely a way to like enhance the performance in your Angular apps. And there'll be another talk with Jessica and Mark about that soon also. But there's more features to the framework that I didn't mention here, but just kind of paint a picture of what Angular has as a framework on its own. And so if we look at the list of some of the meta frameworks that are out there, this is the list that we have there. So Next.js, SvelteKit. Well, let's take a quick poll. Raise your hand if you've used any of these meta frameworks in other ecosystems like SvelteKit or Next.js. Okay, we got a good number of hands here. But yeah, Remix, Astro, I would consider a meta framework because it does exactly that, stitches other frameworks together. Solid Start and Quick City. And all these have common features that meta frameworks, features of meta frameworks. So some of these features that I consider to be table stakes in meta frameworks are things like file-based routing. In Angular, with the Angular router, you can configure your router pretty much any way you want to, just with but you have to do this in code. You do child routes, you can do parent routes, catch-all routes, a lot of those things you can configure. But file-based routing lets you do that in a convention-based way, and I'll get more into that also. Also, server-side rendering. We have projects out there already that do server-side rendering, but we'll kind of talk about that further too. Static site generation, if you think of content sites, and API routes where you can integrate with APIs and kind of build those internally. So with file-based routing, as I mentioned before, you might be used to this convention. You just have a path. You have these objects and paths that you define, which are components. And now we can lazy load individual components. You can lazy load a group of routes, and we also have default exports that you can use here. So on the other side of that, we have file-based routing, where you can define these same conventions for routing, but you don't have to wire up the configuration yourself. The structure of the file system the structure of the routes gets determined by the file system. So for server-side rendering, we talked about this as a possibility to speed up or improve your scores on SEO, which the team has definitely focused on a lot here recently. But this is where you initially render your app on the server, and the HTML is shipped to the client. And before, previously in Angular, this used to be a two-pass thing. You would render on the server, you would bring it on the client, and then it would rebuild the entire app again. But now that we have client hydration with the latest version of Angular, we can do that in one pass. We we ship the HTML to the client, and it just hydrates the application, and we can move forward and, like I said, have better SEO scores and things like that. And this is built into Angular Universal if you want to add this into your app today. So for static site generation, you think of more content-focused sites, landing pages, marketing sites. A big one is blogs. If you want to try to write a blog with your particular stack there, or write a blog with Angular. And Scully is the main one that comes into consideration in this space. So for API routes, it's APIs without external libraries, where you can use these same conventions to build these APIs. And in some cases, these are inline in your route component in terms of like Remix, where they have actions and loaders, where you can define those right next to your route component. Or Next.js, if you're looking at recent Next.js, using something like get static props or get server-side props, or in a new way, we have like route handlers. So these are things that all help you kind of accelerate your development of an application. And of course, I'm right in that crew also. I would like to have these features I want to have these features to help ship Angular apps faster. And that's where Analog came to be. Angular, like I said, Angular itself is a framework, and we want to have that nice experience of a meta framework to go along with it. So I'll talk quickly about some of the building blocks that contributed to where analog is today and how it got started. So one of those is standalone components, which before we had to, when we were using routing, we had to set up an ng module. If you want to lazy load things, you have to put a module in front of everything. But standalone components kind of flip that on its head to where we can define these components, and now we can use those components as routes themselves. Also, the work by the Angular CLI team on ESBuild. Like I said, ESBuild, Angular CLI uses Vite as a dev server, and then uses ESBuild to build that, and then Vite to serve that also. So there, and some of that has gone into this also to help that integration there. And also the transition to ESM across the board has been a bit of a pain in the web ecosystem, but it also kind of helped in this integration also. So let's get into getting started with Vite, or getting started with analog, excuse me. So if you want to create, you can go, like I said, go and try this later on, but you can do npm create analog and create an analog app if you want to create an analog app that uses Angular CLI and everything there. You still get all those tools with stay within the Angular ecosystem there. And if you also want to use NX, we also have integration with that also. So you can create an NX workspace and use the analog.js platform in your workspace to create a workspace with NX there. So, and if you have an existing workspace, you can add analog to your workspace and generate a new app with it there. So want to provide that similar experience there. So let's get into some of the features of analog. Like I said, we talked about meta frameworks, file-based routing, server-side rendering, static site generation, API routes, and server-only data fetching, which is pretty new. So if we look at the file-based routing in analog, like I mentioned before, we can configure these routes based on the folder structure, and you can do things like static routes, dynamic routes, group routes, even catch-all routes, and you can define these as files and folders, and define these layouts to define how you want your URL structure to be in your application. So it gives you, like I said, a faster way to build routes for your application and one thing, this is all still built on top of the Angular router. So you're still able to use everything you can use with the Angular router, even with this file-based system. For server-side rendering, with analog, server-side rendering is like supported by default. You can still use ng-serve, and as Yuri mentioned in his talk, we're using some of the NX executors as far as building and serving with Vite directly, so you can build and serve and use SSR by default there. So different platforms. Like I said, Angular is expanding into other ecosystems, and platforms just such as using Angular in Node or even using Angular on the edge are supported there. And different deployment providers. Of course, this is Angular conference, so a lot of, if all of you are familiar with Firebase, so you have that integration there. So we have deployments for that. If you're using things like Netlify, which is usually my go-to, we have integrations there. And even Vercel or even Edgio is another one that, and there are even more here, providers you can use, but like I said, the goal is to be able to ship your Angular apps to these environments pretty seamlessly. So for static site generation, same thing, ng-build, if you want to pre-render some routes, you can define those routes within your configuration. If you wanted to fetch these routes dynamically, you can use that for, like I said, pre-rendering these also. So for API routes, like I said, this is one popular frameworks like Express or Nest.js. I know it's popular within the Angular ecosystem. Let you define these routes kind of like as a separate application, but you can also use these using this file-based syntax also. So here I have the server directory with some routes in it, and then that will translate to /API/products. So if you're, like I said, want to prototype something really quickly, build an API, you can do that all together and have that already there available. So another thing that we mentioned in Meta frameworks is service. One thing that we mentioned, like I said, recently is server-side data fetching. So we have these pages and we want to define some data that can get loaded alongside these page routes. We can define these server files that you can use to get that data and fetch that data on the server, transfer it to the client. And we also want to integrate in with things like transfer state, where you don't have to make that first request when you hydrate the app on the server. So I'll kind of show what that looks like here. So we have this pages.index.server.ts, just an example. We're using this load function that you can go and fetch data on the server. And you can do all your database interactions here. You can access Node and things like that to return data from this function. So now that we have that server file defined, now we can go back to our route component. And this is how you would define a route component in Analog. You have a default export here, which is already supported by the Angular router. And you can use the load function from the server file that we defined, which is not shipped to the client, by the way. But you can then use that as an input. If you're using the route component input bindings from the Angular router that was recently introduced, you can consume that data as an input, or you can just use the inject load function to use that as an observable or convert it to a signal. So now you may be saying, and I've heard this more a few times, Analog is cool, I should try it out. I've heard this more than a few times. But they're saying, why are you doing this? Why are you building this project? It's a pretty ambitious goal, right? And the thing is ecosystems. We want to expand Angular into other ecosystems, keep pushing the platform forward, and keep pushing it into new areas. Like I said, providing the integration with Vite as far as the plugin goes allows Angular to use Angular in different environments. If you want to use Angular components in Astro, you can do that. If you want to use Angular components in Quick, you can do that. You want to use Angular with Vitest, which is a testing tool built on top of Vite, you can do that also, which has APIs compatible with Jest, so you can run your tests in that environment also. You want to use something like Playwright, we can expand there. There's also projects like Spartan Project, which is built on top of Analog. It's a full stack application that you can get out of the box. It's built by Robin, and you can definitely see this fire logo that he built for this project. So, of course, this is open source, and we want to encourage contributions to Analog. So, a few ways you can contribute to Analog is GitHub issues, documentation, and of course, pull requests are always welcome because we want to make sure this, Angular and Analog has a place in the stack of whatever stack you're trying to build for. We're trying to support that. So just to talk about the community, we've had over 40 plus contributors already to the project, which I'm pretty excited about. And we also had over 1,200 stars on GitHub, and also got an awesome chance to participate in the GitHub Accelerator that recognizes open source projects that have the potential to go and be maintained full time. We also had the Discord community there. And you can also follow Analog.js on Twitter if you want to keep up with updates on that. So even with that, we also have new team members. Like I said, Robin has done a bunch of awesome work with Analog and helped building features there. And you may recognize this similar face, Marco, who's been on the NGRX team and is also working on Analog to help push things forward also. If you want to get involved with Analog, you can visit the GitHub repo here. And also, if you want to help support Analog in other ways, you can also sponsor the project. If you want to use Analog for your company, or you just want to support the project to keep it moving forward, you can visit our page about sponsoring Analog, or just see me afterwards there. So to recap, we talked about Vite, ecosystems, integration together, and how we can put these things together to create a nice integrated experience for Angular. Talked about meta frameworks, file-based routing, features like that you can use to help build your Angular apps faster. And we talked about analog, how we're wanting to expand Angular into other ecosystems and use those bring those ecosystems to Angular as well. Thanks.